Perdona, pero no sé qué pasó, no podía conectarme.
Bienvenido, Tomás, bienvenidos a todos. Gracias por esperar y gracias por lograr hablar del inconveniente. Así que ahora todos bienvenidos y te dejo, Tommaso, adelante para que comiences tu clase cuando tú quieras.
Perfecto. Voy a compartir.
¿Qué tal, Tommaso? ¿Cómo estás?
Gabriel, ¿estás por ahí?
¿Conseguiste conectarte?
Sí, al final sí. Perdón, no sé qué pasó.
No te escuchamos. Yo no te escucho, por lo menos, ¿sabes? Es que estoy sin
todavía no
sonido.
me...
Ahora sí, ayer que estaba sin sonido.
Perfecto. Perfecto. No, porque sí, no, sigo teniendo problemas de conexiones. Bueno, pero ahora funciona, ¿sí?
Sí, te escuchamos
Perfecto.
bien.
Perfecto. Gracias. Y no, disculpen. Bueno, entonces vamos por la tercera parte de la clase. Y en fin, vamos a discutir lo que ya que hablamos. Déjenme poner también los comentarios acá. Bueno, déjenme pasar en inglés también. So we've been discussing so far a number of issues why we want to study development and structural change, looking at the system as a complex system, and why this is related to the fact that the innovation is one of the main engines for structural change and development, and innovation is in itself a process which has the features of a complex system, and therefore. Because of this, we also discussed that we need to use tools which allow us to understand those systems and analyze them from the bottom up. So to understand how the macroeconomic interactions lead to the macroeconomic outcomes, and this leads us to understand, as we mentioned, development as the interaction between different aspects of structural change, and we discussed this as well in the tutorial in the first day last week. And now we go to study, and to give an example, now that we've been discussing for all those 2 days about all these ideas and theories and innovations and complexity. So how do we do it? How do we understand, using the models that we discussed yesterday at the macro level, to understand the development and structural change as an evolutionary and complex system. Let me turn this off. Okay, so as usual, we'll give a little bit of background in terms of the empirical evidence, why structural change is so relevant and why economic development is so related to innovation. So we give a little bit of stylized facts about the relation between innovation and growth, and very briefly how this has been seen in theory. We then introduce structural change, and then we move to the model, and we analyze several aspects of actually a series of models that look at interaction between structural change and growth. As usual, these are the main references in relation to theory on evolution and agent-based model macro for reference. And the main reference in terms of agent-based model and growth, and the reference in terms of growth and structural models in relation to growth and structural change. But as usual, all the references that we discuss as part of the lecture are also available at the end of the slides. Okay, so the relation between innovation and economic development. First of all, before we start with this, is there any question related to what we've been discussing so far in terms of the relevance of innovation for structural change itself, and the properties of innovation in a complex system, and the use of agent-based models? Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so this is the main question that we have in mind, okay, and that we want to discuss today. In particular, if you look at this table, what you observe is an estimation of GDP per capita a little bit a few years ago in 1000, from when we have some information from the data, which is obviously not entirely reliable, but gives us a quite good estimation derived by Madison. And what we observed here, what is important to observe, is that if you look at 1,000 years ago, and if we look at GDP per capita across different areas of the world, and we look at the relation between the ratios between the GDP per capita across these different parts of the world, what we observe is that they're all extremely similar. Okay, so we start from 1,000 years ago, when regions across the world are very similar in terms of output per capita. Okay, then so all these regions have been growing at very similar rates, which are very linear. And then we jump 500 years ahead, and we do observe that there is some differences. There are some differences between Western Europe and the rest of the world. And the rest of the world is pretty much all the same. Western Europe is a little bit different with respect to the rest of the world. But again, I mean, we're talking about a difference across an international spread across the different areas of 1.9, and a spread between the West and the rest, which is 1.3. So very similar. Then there's something that happens between, something major happens between 1500 and 1800, where you do see some areas, such as Western Europe, Western Offshoot, which is basically the US, and overall the West, which actually starts increasing, GDP starts increasing quite substantially with respect to other parts of the world. And this spread between the West and the rest doubles and becomes 2 times. And from here on, the pattern of growth between this area of the world and this area of the world is dramatically different. We observe an exponential rate of growth in the western part of the world, and we continue to observe a linear growth, and only very recently, which becomes a little bit more exponential in the rest of the world. And as you can observe, in the meanwhile, the difference between the West and the rest increases by a large amount of times. Okay, so what we need to understand here, what is so spectacular that happens around these years, which makes this huge difference between one specific part of the world and the rest of the world. And I'm sure you have theories, I'm sure you've seen this quite a lot, and you've been thinking about this quite a lot before. But this is what we want to explain, and we want a theory which allows us to explain these huge differences through time. Sorry, I make it a little bit bigger so that it's easy to see. So one candidate that we have, one important candidate that we have, is innovation. And what we have here is, as we've been measuring innovation so far, is using patents. So we still look at patents, and let's have a look at number of patent applications and how they increase in those years. Remember, these are the years that which are our candidates for this incredible change in the rate of growth. So let's look at what happens to a measure of innovation, such as patents in these years. This is not moving forward. Okay, so patents application do increase for a number of reasons. Also because they become, there were no property rights before. Patents granted increase substantially in all the world, but this is the share of patents granted by the US Patent Office to US countries and to foreign countries. So what we observe here is that US, obviously we're talking about a US Patent Office, but we use US Patent Office because whatever firm want to compete at the global level has to patent the technology also in the US. So it's an important reference, and what we observe here is that the US keep their domination in terms of innovation across all the years. And if we look at the share of patents in developing countries, this is extremely small, right? We're talking about less than 5% when we reach the recent years. But if we exclude South Korea from the what was developing country in the 80s and 90s, the share becomes really, really tiny, right? We're talking about 0.5% of all the patents registered in USPTO coming from all low-income countries, all developing countries. Everything else is patented either in the US or in a high-income country. Okay, so there is some correlation here between a very crude measure of innovation and this amazing change in terms of output. We can look at other measures. Patents in the USPTO are maybe biased. So we look at, for example, R&D as a percentage of GDP in between 87 and 97. Now here we have the average for OECD countries, which is 2% of R&D. Of GDP in R&D expenditure, and then we have low-income countries and middle-income countries where this expenditure is definitely much lower. Same thing if we look at in PPP terms, we find same huge differences. Same thing if you look at the number of scientists and engineers per population. The average in the OECD is around 3,000. If we look at low-income countries, we can get as low as 15 or 37 in the case of Colombia, right? So we have different measures of what would be innovation inputs and output suggest that areas which became extremely rich were also particularly strong, are also particularly strong in innovation. This is an index, an innovation index from the work by Fagerberg and Sherlock, which combines a number of these indicators: scientific articles, patents application, R&D expenditure, doctor enrollment, the enrollment in STEMs, number of professionals, trademark, ISO certification, so on and so forth. And when you look at the relation between GDP per capita and technological capability measured by all these different variables using a combined using a PCA, you see that there is a very strong linear positive relation. Okay, so this is what we observe: this strong, very strong relation between innovation and development, which is what we've been arguing for. We need to look at innovation dynamics and how innovation change in order to understand processes of economic development in relation to structural change, as we will discuss in a second. Now, as you know, sorry, any questions so far about this evidence? All good? Okay. So, as you know, lots of theories have been discussing the relation between innovation and economic growth. This doesn't make too much justice to all these theories. It summarizes all of these theories in one single slide. Innovation, as you know, was already considered by Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, and by the classical economists. And then from there, you had different ways of looking at economic growth, taking into account more or less innovation. And as you know, one led to focusing on the use of factors and the first of all the standard the classical neoclassical growth theory with Arrow and learning by doing. Then this became the endogenous growth theory. As you all know, on the other hand, much more building on elements of cumulative causation from the theories of Young and Keynesian theories, Keynesian growth theories, which are less about innovation, but more about the accumulation of factors. And when it is combined with Schumpeterian idea about the use of R&D in economic growth, the use of innovation the relevance of creative destruction in innovation, then you have a derivation from the endogenous growth theory, which is focused on Schumpeterian thinking in terms of the role of innovation, such as that we discussed in last week, 2 lectures ago. From which then we have evolutionary growth models, and from there a combination between the more post-Keynesian theories and Galdorian theories and evolutionary growth models in a sort of synthesis now in a sort of Schumpeter meet Keynes, in these models that use both Keynesian and Schumpeterian idea to discuss economic development and growth. Now, all these are extremely useful models. Few of these, actually none of these, take seriously into account structural change. So we discussed two weeks ago that structural change is actually a much closer determinant about how economies evolve, and as we'll see in a moment, they are in the structural change in a much better position to explain us than innovation alone, to explain us this incredible difference that emerges between Western countries and the rest of the world. So this to quote a reading that we discussed last week from Brian Arthur. When we talk about structural change, unfortunately, we come into a territory that economic theory does not usually enter into, but it's not an empty territory. It is inhabited by historians such as Gabriel, which is a good news for us. In our case, by economic historians. Historians see the introduction of new technologies not simply as causing readjustment and growth, but as causing changes in the composition of the economy itself, which is in its structure. And it is difficult to connect, in theory, these different innovations that evolve through time, because as we've seen, it is not easy to model the way in which they evolve using standard economic theories, and the structural changes that they cause. Why? Because when we talk about causing changes in the composition of the economy itself, we're considering models where you need to change these compositions, which is not easy again if we use models of analytical solutions, because the structure of this model is fixed. So this is what we want to try to do, to introduce changes in the structure in different ways, along different lines in the model, in order to understand how structural change may explain or not economic growth. So let's go back for a second to our main question here. How does it happen that one specific part of the world, which used to be relatively similar in terms of GDP per capita only 1,000 years ago, becomes very, very different in the following years and follows a completely different trajectory of growth? Now, we've seen this is definitely related to innovation, okay? But that's not enough. That innovation does changes, as we've seen, the structure of the economies. And again, let's make a few examples here. If I just manage to move forward. Now, we all know some of these changes occur at the sectoral level. So a particularly large difference that we observe between, again, these spectacular years in which we observe this incredible surge of this incredible difference between OECD Western countries and the rest of the world. What happened in OECD countries? As we know, there is a sharp movement of employment and value added from agriculture to services. Okay, so there's a completely restructuring of the sectors, something that happens in much less in Latin America and a little bit in Asia, and almost nothing in African countries. This is part of the story, right? Is looking at the story that we all know. changes in the sectoral composition, which is still, I mean, we still have to take into account, obviously, it's hugely relevant, but it's part of the story. This is another part of the story, which is hugely relevant, what people consume in this area. So this is, again, an estimation of what the average household used to consume in the 17th century in England and Wales. Let's take England and Wales because this is where the Industrial Revolution starts, which, as we will see in a second, is our main candidate for explaining these changes in the structure of the economy and this difference in the way in which different parts of the world evolve. So let's see a typical consumption basket in the 17th centuries in what would be now the UK, England and Wales. 75% of the expenditure were in basic goods: food, beverage and tobacco, clothing. And a very tiny amount in other goods, which, if you want, are luxury or recreational goods. Now we look at a similar composition in 1996 for the United Kingdom. 23% is now mainly basic goods, 50% is luxury goods, and then obviously we have a huge increase in the role of the government. So there is a substantial change in the way in which people consume, and this is very much interrelated to what is happening on the sectoral side, obviously taking into account trade dynamics as well. But think about one particular aspect here, which is relevant, and which probably Gabriel knows much more than all of us here. What was the main textile that was produced and used in the UK in those years? What was the main source of producing clothing and footwear at the time in the UK? Any idea?
Maybe wool.
Wool, exactly. However, when we observe this change here, what is happening in the UK is that wool becomes the least wanted source of clothing. And what is the let's say symbol of the Industrial Revolution and the product which becomes one of the elements of the Industrial Revolution in the UK? Thanks, Mario. Cotton, right? Not something which was produced in the UK, not something which the UK was particularly good at. Obviously, it's a little bit cold. It is known today. It's difficult to grow cotton in this country. Obviously, this is related to extracting resources from colonies. But it's related to what else? It's related to the fact that as soon as other textiles are introduced, actually silk first, the demand, particularly of part of the population, and these are the high class in the population, start shifting because people do not like to wear wool because it's uncomfortable on the skin, and obviously they start using silk and cotton, and they see that this is a much more comfortable way of dressing, and therefore a demand starts to change. So it's not that we just observe structural change because there are the colonies, which is obviously a hugely important, but also because there are, and so the production, the price of the different factors of production change. But there is a huge change in the demand here, and actually there is a strong fight in these periods between lobbies of wool producers and producers of clothing using wools, and the new industry which is producing cotton textile. And there are huge trade wars. There is a ban initially to the import of cotton because the producers of the incumbent producers of clothing in the UK do not appreciate the inclusion of cotton because it uses technology that do not know how to use, and it obviously reduces their market. However, that happens. That happens, and is part of the industrial revolution because there is a change in the way in which people consume. So this is something that we have to take into account, right? And these are, consumers. These are people like us in different classes. Of course, as I said, this starts is not the miners who ask for pricey cotton and silk clothing. It's the growing bourgeoisie and the nobles. But there is a demand for those goods, which starts changing. There is something else. There is the geography, and there is the capabilities that through centuries so far, different countries have been able to develop according to the resources that they have been able to use in the past centuries and millennia. So this is a theory which comes from Diamond, which looks at how the initial availability of very basic resources and those selection processes that we discussed last week, for example, in selecting wheat, in selecting maize, in selecting different animals to use to produce resources, have created the conditions to understand how to combine some of these factors and create other goods. So here again, we talk about combining the wool to create garments, to combine next cotton to create garments. Cotton is something which comes from India, of course, but comes through Eurasia, so it's something which is connected to Europe. So there is a slow development of capabilities that allow certain countries to learn how to produce some of these goods, and do not allow other countries that have a different set of resources to use, and that therefore develop their abilities and capabilities in very different trajectories, and their demand in very different trajectories. Okay, so there are these very stark differences in terms of geography, which relate to factor endowments, which relate to the creation of capabilities which are built through time, the knowledge we've been discussing for a long time, which is necessary to innovate. And this knowledge is created in certain parts of the world and not in other parts of the world. And this knowledge creates again is behind again the ability to produce certain products and not to produce other products. So this is the idea behind the product space, which was developed mainly by Hidalgo, with the help of our friend Ricardo Hausmann, and looking at how different products are related to each other, because simply the same countries produce the same product. So the fact that a given country produces product A and product B, and you observe that most countries that produce product A produce also product B, gives an intuition that there must be some similar capabilities to produce product A and product B. So this is using this very simple intuition. What they do, they look at this similarity across products, across countries, and they define this product space, which is basically clustering different goods according to their similarity and deriving from their clusters of industries, which make total sense to our understanding of the industries. So you have clusters, for example, of electronics, clusters of vehicles, mining, fishing, vegetables, garments, so on and so forth. Okay, so what they develop is this map of different products that different countries produce, and what you can do once you have this map, this static map, is to understand how different countries, different regions of the world, compare in terms of their in their specialization, using the Balassa index here, in different products in this space. So here you have the industrialized countries, mainly specialized in the core, with a relative comparative advantage on the core of the products which are most sophisticated and require more knowledge and innovation. So here, these are garments, for example, which are totally excluded. Who specialized in garments? East Asia and the Pacific, who developed their capabilities mainly around garments and around the electronic clusters here. Latin America and the Caribbean, totally on the periphery. Garments, these are natural resources. I think these are stones and minerals. And Sub-Saharan Africa, even more on the periphery. Okay, so this gives us an idea about how different regions in the world slowly develop capabilities into different products and specialize into different products, which are more or less core in understanding how to produce new products. And you can look at this dynamically. So this is an example of Malaysia, for example, and you have the product space of Malaysia in 1985 first, where you have a little bit of production in electronics. So they already started developing some capability in electronics, and a little bit of capabilities here in garments, and not much else. Some things dispersed here and there, some natural resources. And the idea here, what these graphs show, and what the whole point of Hidalgo and Hausmann here is that countries such as Malaysia, how do they move? How do they expand to their next sectors? How they evolve in terms of structural change? They focus more and more on those products which are similar in terms of sectoral similarities, therefore potentially in terms of the capabilities of producing these products. And do not enter products which are much more difficult to produce and far away from their capabilities. So Malaysia, who starts with some production in electronics, expands mainly around the electronics clusters. Does not enter other clusters where the main competitors are the North America, Europe, and Japan, but expands in the area in which they have these capabilities. And you can, I mean, there's if you want, there's a whole. Well, there's a number of those exercises, but there's a whole website we won't have the time now to explore. There's a whole dashboard that you can explore to look at the changes in various countries along this product space. So if Turkey, it's an interesting example, for example. You see that this would be Turkey in 1995, and you see how they do move from this mainly garment specialization, nearer and nearer to the core, but starting from these garment specializations and this basically food specialization. So this is a slow process of changes in the sector, which is related to those capabilities which are accumulated through time. So this knowledge which is accumulated through time is relevant, and we go back to the innovation part, innovation component. And then there are a large number of changes which we won't go into details, but one can start looking at, for example, in the case of the Industrial Revolution in the UK, which are particularly, I mean, as you know, Industrial Revolution in the UK has been the case most studied in terms of historical structural change. So here is where we have lots of evidence, and what people have observed here is a number of stylized facts that we do observe in many other countries as they develop, as they go through the process of structural change, which leads to higher income. One of them is the concentration of production in fewer and fewer, larger and larger firms. And this is related to specialization of labor. So obviously economies of scales, but also economies of knowledge. As we discussed in the previous lecture, knowledge accumulates. And those who enter the correct trajectories, those firms who enter the correct trajectories of knowledge and innovation, manage to accumulate even more. And then you have this process of concentration, which you do observe basically as a secular tendency all over the world, but in all cases in which you observe development. You still have a huge mass of small and medium enterprises that absorb a huge amount of employment, don't get me wrong. But the tendency is of increased concentration, and now people recently have been talking about superstar firms, which are these massive conglomerates that dominate world economies. So this is one aspect that we need to take into account. There is this strong change, not only in the sectors, not only in the consumption, not only in the capabilities and innovation, but also in the way in which the production is structured and organized. We move from small workshops where you could produce iron and wool garments to large factories, which are capital intensive. The number of goods which are available keeps increasing. Right? So you have not only a change in the specialization of different countries, but also a growth in the overall number of countries. We do observe during the Industrial Revolution something which is crucial, the relation between the sciences and the technology. So if you remember when we discussed how a usual linear process of innovation occurs, where you have the basic science, and then you have the applied science, and then you have the laboratories where you test new products, so on and so forth. Now, this can occur if you integrate what happens in the sciences and what happens in the technology. So what happens in developing theories which are unrelated or relatively unrelated to the technological development, but which are used by technological development. And there's a very nice parts of Moquet's book on which explain Industrial Revolution, where it does show the reluctance in France, for example, which was very similar to the UK in terms of advances in science, and actually was more advanced in terms of science. But the reluctance of the scientists to engage with anything which was related to everyday problems. Sciences were the philosophy, were the physics, were something which was above everything else. Technologies where the handicraft was a different part of the society. It is people like Watts that start integrating knowledge from science and knowledge from practice, and this becomes crucial. So integrating this aspect of research and development in the innovation process. And obviously increased use of capital, first of all in agriculture and in manufacturing, with improvement in the productivity of the capital vintages. So here again, this accumulation of knowledge, which allows these capital vintages to become even more productive and replace more and more labor. But you also have many other changes, which we normally do not take into consideration. Urbanization. People move from the countryside to urban areas. Urban areas become the core of the economic activity, become the most polluted places, become the place where people can interact and acquire more knowledge. We have an increase in income inequality. As we know, from the main stylized factor of the Kuznets curve. But we also have changes in social classes, and in particularly during the Industrial Revolution is where the class of the bourgeoisie develops, which is the class of the entrepreneurs, those who take those risks of using information from knowledge from research and development applied in order to innovate and produce something new and differently. So these social classes, why it is relevant? Because as we saw before, they start demanding for cotton and silk. The demand for cotton and silk creates incentives for investment in the production of cotton and silk, creates incentive to improve the technology in the production of cotton and silk, so on and so forth. So all these aspects are strongly interrelated one to another. All these aspects of structural change are strongly interrelated. And some of them precede economic growth, such as the capitalization of agriculture. Some follow them, some follows economic growth, such as the increases in demand and the creation of new social classes. Okay. Any question? All clear? Okay, so this is what we want to study. We want to study the way in which structural changes, which does involve very different aspects of the economy, as we just went through a very small sample, does influence economic growth and development. And so we use quite a particular definition of structural change, which goes beyond the structure of employment and value added. So in this case, for example, we use the definition in the Dictionary of Economics by our friend Matsuyama, who defines structural change as a complementary changes in various aspects of the economy, such as the factor composition of output and employment, which is what we normally take into account, but as well the organization of industry, the financial system, income and wealth distribution, demography, political institutions, and obviously the society by the systems. Now, I think this definition is extremely, extremely nice for structural change. One problem is that if you look at all the models developed by Matsuyama, this definition is never seriously taken into account by him. Gabriele is not being a little bit provocative because there's a strong friendship between Mario Cimoli and Matsuyama, but this is another story. But the issue here is that this definition is very, very nice. However, Matsuyama, who has been working also his life on models of structural change, never takes into account this definition. He always focuses only on the composition of output and employment. Now, interestingly, in the same year, there's a paper published by Saviotti and Gaffar, which defines structural change in a very similar way. Changes in the structure of the economic system, that is in its components and their interactions, where the components are particular goods or services, activities and institutions such as technology, types of knowledge, organizational forms, so on and so forth. Okay, so again, this idea that you have different changes in different parts of the system. Now, what Saviotti and Gaffard add, though, which is extremely relevant here, which is what we've been discussing in the past 2 days, and if you want, in reaction to the definition that Matsuyama gives, but never takes into account seriously, what does it mean for a system to be in equilibrium when its composition keeps changing due to the emergence of qualitatively different entities? In other words, if we want to seriously take into account structural change and the relation between structural change and economic development, we need to use models which allow us to change the structure of the economy, which allows us to observe how the structure of the economy evolves through time together with economic development and growth. So this is what we do here now. And present this sort of general model of economic development and growth through structural change. So we developed a number of these models with different features, but the main features, different applications, but the main features of the core model is that we try to embed 5 general types of structural change in the same model. The first of them is on the supply side, the organization of production, the way in which firms organize the production. And we do this by taking into account the structure of labor, firm size, and earning disparities. So the wage distribution across different types and functions along the production structure of a company, which endogenously changes. The technology of production, which is the capital vintages which is used in producing, and how these capital vintages evolve through time in coordination with other aspects of the economy. So the speed of change in capital innovation, the share of R&D, and the success of R&D, which is related to that link, if you want, between research and development, and the composition of production. So which goods are produced in terms of specialization and in terms of demand. So embedding, endogenizing the exploration of firms to discover new sectors, to innovate in new sectors, and to improve the quality of products in new sectors. So as we mentioned, if you remember last week, one thing is to introduce a new good, which is normally very bad when it is introduced. It's very poor in terms of quality, and to improve the quality of those goods, which occurs through incremental innovation. On the demand side, changes in the distribution of income through changes in profits, but also changes in the composition of workers in the firm, so the structure of production, and changes in consumption patterns, so changes in what consumers, the basket that consumers consume, depending on their different classes, but also the different preferences. So the changes in preferences with respect, for example, to quality and price of the different consumers. Importantly, as we see in such a model, all these aspects of structural change that we include in the model are interrelated. They're not independent one from the other, but they depend one on the other as the economy evolves. Okay, so just to be clear, we've been discussing this a lot. Obviously, we are taking some assumptions which are not traditional in terms of modeling economic growth. The model is constantly out of equilibrium, so it tries to reach some sort of stable state, but every time there is changes in the model, there is structural change. So all these structural changes alter continuously those states of those stable states. All decisions are taken out of equilibrium, so all the agents consider the information that they have in relation to a system which is changing. So their choices are usually dynamically wrong because they're not able to foresee the changes which are caused by all other actors in the systems. So agents are obviously not fully rational. They adapt their behavior in response to previous events. Time is crucial here. Time is for real and creates path dependency. What happens in the past cannot be recovered. If you make choices, those choices remain in the system, and the consequences of those choices remain in the system. And well, we can discuss this in terms of the way in which we develop consumption choice if we have time. Preferences are normothetic. Capital is built through time. So if a firm needs to invest, That means that a firm requires the capital to invest. That means that you need another firm who has to produce that capital. So investment decision is not something that happens in a nanosecond. Investment decision, which is done by a firm, requires then to be implemented by ordering capitals, producing capital. So this requires time. So again, time is taken seriously here. And firms have a hierarchical structure, which is partly mapped into the task that different workers have. But as we see, it's particularly relevant in terms of the structure of these firms. So because we have very little time, I won't go in the equations of the model, but I'm happy to do that if there's any question about any of the details of the model. But I want to give you the intuition of the model. The model behind is relatively complex, yeah, there are some of the details which I think are very interesting, but in the interest of time, I'll focus on the main features of the model and the main results. So, as I said, there are different versions of this model, but I'm taking a sort of a generalized version where we have 4 main sectors. We have a sector of final demand firms, and these final demand firms are distributed across different industries that produce different goods. Different goods satisfy different needs of the consumers. These final demand firms use labor, which we'll see in a minute, and they use capital. So we have a second sector, which is the capital good firms. Capital good firms are also obviously heterogeneous firms. They produce different type of capital with different levels of productivity, and this is the source of investment for the final demand firms. Then we have the household sector, and the household sector buys goods from the final demand firms, supplies labor to the final demand firms and to the capital goods firms, and in exchange they receive a wage and bonuses. Now, crucially here is that firms are structured as we normally observe firms along a pyramidal structure. What does it mean? It means that we have a class of workers, which are the shop floor workers. So these are the productive workers. These are those that produce things in a company. And then we have a series, and then we have a second layer of workers who are those who coordinate the production at the shop floor workers. So this is the first tier of managers. Then you have a second tier of manager that coordinate a production on above level, a third tier of managers, so on and so forth, until you get to the CEOs. Okay, now this is how firms are structured, and this is how the society is structured. We have different classes that map one-to-one the structure of the firm, and those different functions of employment within the firm. So all these workers will earn a different wage. Some of them will earn bonuses on top of wages. All these workers have different preferences in terms of what they consume, and they have a different consumption basket. And this relation, the number of classes that we observe in the model is endogenous, because it entirely depends on the way in which firms in the final goods sector and in the capital goods sector develop through time. So if these companies grow, then also their tiers and the number of workers and the number of classes will grow. If firms remain small, like in the pre-industrial revolution scenario, then these firms will only be made by shop floor workers and perhaps a manager, which is the owner. It is only when firms grow and develop that they start creating those new tiers of workers, and therefore new classes emerge, and therefore new styles of consumption emerge. And then we have a financial sector, which is a very simple financial sector, basically collects savings from the consumers, which are not spent, and use these savings to give loans to firms in the final goods sectors and in the capital goods sectors. Okay, and then if firms are not able to pay back these loans, well, these firms actually pay back these loans with their profits, which are given back to the banking sector and then distributed to the households. And when firms in the final goods sector become insolvent, they basically go bankrupt and exit from the market. And then we have firms that keep coming in the market. Okay. Is the overall model clear? Any question? Okay. Now I have a few slides that go a little bit more in detail of how the final demand firms work in terms of the way in which we model production, the factors of production, the way in which they make decisions with respect to sales, with respect to inventories that they keep. There's a lot of details in the model in terms of how these actors behave, which I'm happy to go back in the discussion, but I think it's important to go to discuss some of the results. But basically, this is an agent-based model, right? So we have these very detailed decisions about how these different firms behave, and obviously firms producing, making their choices in terms of production, making their choices in terms of hiring and paying wages, giving bonuses, investing in new capital. The decision of investing in new capital is important because they will select capital goods from different capital suppliers that also have different features in terms of the capital vintage that they produce. Some will produce capital vintages which are more productive, some will produce capital vintages which are more or less expensive, so on and so forth. So you keep having these relationships between different firms in the final goods sectors and different firms in the capital goods sector, which evolve through time. And again, as the structure in the final goods sector changes, this will have an influence on the incentive for the capital goods firms to innovate. Final goods firms also innovate. They compete on price and quality, and in order to increase the quality, they invest in R&D. This allows them to explore new sectors through time, and so to create new goods, which may or not be preferable to new classes that at the same time emerge. So the creation of new goods and sectors, again, here is endogenous and occurs through time. Firms also increase the quality of these goods within given sectors. And this is important because the high-level classes have the demand. Classes will differ with respect to their earnings, their propensity to save, their consumption shares across the 10 industries. So the let's say shop floor, so the less wealthy classes consume mainly basic goods and only a small fraction of basic goods. As new classes emerge, they will shift their production patterns from basic goods to luxury goods. So this will all obviously change as well the incentives for firms in different industries to invest in R&D and produce different goods. And these classes also have different preferences for quality and price, where I won't go into details of that choice, but basically consumers will, in high-income classes, prefer high-quality goods, and they're totally inelastic with respect to price. So firms that sell to those classes do not compete particularly strongly on price. They could make any price because the final consumers will buy them. However, firms that produce for the bottom classes compete much more on prices because the less wealthy consumers are very inelastic with respect to the quality, but very elastic with respect to price. So the competition in terms of price for firms for firms that sell mainly to lower income classes is very high. And this again changes the way in which the model may evolve depending on how the different classes evolve, their preferences evolve, their consumption shares evolve, and how the firms in the final goods sector evolve. Because the way in which the firms in the final goods sector evolve, as we mentioned, implies that this will generate or not, more classes that emerge. Okay, so before we go to the results, is there any question about the details of the model, which might be important for you to understand how the model works and to understand the results? Okay, so let me go straight to the first set of results that I would like to discuss with you, to show you, which is comparing the relevance of different aspects of structural change. So we mentioned that we have those 5 different aspects of structural change on the organization and production, on the technology, and on the products which are produced, and on the income distribution, and on the preferences of consumers and the consumption shares of consumers. So what we do now is we start the model from a state that we discussed before. All the economies are the same, with linear growth, low income per capita, very few sectors, very few products, And we try to understand, as the model evolves, under which conditions and which aspects of structural change among these 5 aspects of structural change seem more relevant for economic development, for growth, than others, and to which extent these aspects interact. So as an initialization here, we have 100 manufacturing firms that they're all the same initially. They only differ with respect to the quality of the product they produce. We only have initially only 2 goods, so only 2 sectors which are produced, and firms can expand and explore up to 10 different goods and needs to offer to the demand. We only start initially with 2 income classes. This is like considering micro firms or craftsmen or farms, so very small firms that produce mainly using shop floor workers and 1 owner. There is obviously a large number of parameters which are not tested here, which, as we discussed yesterday, are based on empirical observation. I'm happy to go to detail for that. In the beginning, we have the consumption share. As I mentioned, all the consumers, which is the basic classes, mainly consume basic goods, and we assume that the asymptotic class that will emerge has the same consumption share of the richest centile in the UK in 2005. As I mentioned, we do not know how many classes will emerge because this is endogenous in the model, right? So we have only an asymptotic distribution of consumption shares. So what we model here is the change of the consumption shares. So we start with mainly basic goods to, if the model grows and new classes emerge, mainly luxury goods for the top classes. All the results that you will see are averages across a number of simulations, either 200 simulations or 20 simulations, to control for the effect of the stochastic processes in the model. So to make sure that the results that we observe are robust. We validate the model in terms of the model, and again, I'm happy to go into the details of this. The model shows dynamics which are very similar to the dynamics that we observe in terms of the takeoff in that we observe and that we've seen in the data during and after the industrial revolution. So initially grows endogenously in a linear form, and when some of those structural conditions lead to an accumulation of capital, innovation, and consumption, following basically a Kaldorian process, then you observe this takeoff, moving from an initial linear growth model to an exponential growth model. We observe Kuznets curve. We observe the emergence of the new goods, as we discussed last week. This usual S shape in the diffusion of new goods. We do observe everywhere Kaldor-Verdon law. We do observe capital deepening, productivity, which is autocatalytic. We observe fluctuations in the short-run fluctuation in the economy, both in terms of output and prices, so on and so forth. So we have a number of stylized facts that we do reproduce. Now we have a huge amount of parameters that define the different aspects of structural change. And let me go first to this slide, actually, which clarifies the other slides a bit more. So we mentioned before, don't look at the symbols here because we haven't seen the model details, but let's focus on the 5 categories of structural change, 5 aspects of structural change that we mentioned. Organizational production. The organizational production is defined we test changes in the organizational production with a parameter that defines the number of workers that each manager can control. Why this is relevant? Because this defines the shape of that pyramid, which represent the firms. Okay, so if we have a manager who can manage many workers, you will have extremely flat organization. right? So you have many shop floor workers that are managed by one manager, and only when you reach to many first level manager, you will have a third level manager. So basically, when the number of workers per manager is low, this means that the structural change in the organization of production is also slow. In the organizational production, we also have a parameter which controls for the wage differential among these different tiers of the firm, which obviously have implications for inequality. The second aspect of structural change is the technology of production, and we play with three parameters here. One parameter that determines the rate at which the productivity in new vintages change when we have a successful R&D process. So the higher is this parameter, the higher is the increase in productivity for a given investment in R&D. A parameter which controls exogenously for the probability that the innovation is successful. So again, the higher is this parameter, the quicker will be the changes in productivity in the process. And the share of R&D, which is invested by capital firms instead of distributing these profits to managers. And again, this will accelerate the intensity of R&D, and therefore the emergence of new, more productive capital vintages. Third aspect of structural change is composition of production, new sectors. So we have a parameter which controls for an exogenous probability given investment in discovering new sectors. So the higher this probability, the more likely that new sector emerge as firms do R&D. A parameter which is similar to the one for the capital goods firms that define the rate of investment of firms, so how many of their profits are invested into R&D instead of being distributed to managers. This will accelerate, this will increase the probability of discovering new sectors, and the increase in the quality of the new product when firms innovate within the same sector, so not discovering new sectors. On the demand side, two parameters on both for the final good firms and the capital good firms that define the profit shares, so the markup basically that firms put on their labor cost, on their variable cost. So the higher profits, higher are the profits distributed to managers, and higher the inequality which is embedded introduced in the model. And two parameters which determine the consumption behavior. The first one is the speed at which consumption patterns change as new classes emerge. So again, remember, we have classes that change their consumption basket, and because they change and they move from basic goods to luxury goods. What is the speed at which this structural change occurs? And this parameter controls for that speed. So the higher this parameter, the stronger the structural change on the consumption share side. And how quickly the preferences across classes change. So as I mentioned before, low-income classes would prefer low price goods, and they're indifferent with respect to quality, and high income classes prefer high quality goods and are indifferent with respect to price. And these changes through classes may occur quickly. You have the new classes that emerge that already have this preference for quality and no elasticity for prices, or again, this can happen slowly, so that the classes are very similar one to another. Now, we have, yeah.
How do you determine the classes between different countries, if they have maybe different incomes or different behaviors of consumption? Like, it's a determined distinction between classes, like low classes, you said before, a low class prefer low budget prices, low wages, prefer a budget saves. I don't understand this distinction between classes and incomes and behavior consumption.
Well, I mean, this comes from sort of some empirical evidence when you look at the sensitivity of different classes for different characteristics of the goods, but it is an assumption that we make that, again, we're not talking about preferences. The consumption behavior here is a little bit, so we're mimicking preferences, but we're not talking about real elasticity. The consumption pattern here is that consumers will observe all the goods produced by firms, will observe their prices and their quality, and consumers have thresholds. So imagine that you have to buy a computer, a laptop, and you need a laptop which has a certain characteristics in terms of power, in terms of memory, in terms of weight, in terms of size, so on and so forth, right? And you have a budget. So you have £100 and you want to buy a laptop. If you are low-income consumer, the amount that you have to buy, a low-income consumer, the amount that you have to buy this laptop is relatively low. You cannot go beyond a certain threshold. However, you are happy to buy from any firm who sells a laptop below £100. And then in that area, below £100, you look at you choose all the firms that produce a laptop which is similar to the characteristics that you want in terms of quality. So basically, we use lexicographic preferences here. We order the characteristics of the good, and then we allow for consumers to set a threshold. So what we're saying is that the price threshold for low-income classes is lower than for high-income classes. That's the only thing we're saying. And the quality threshold for low-income classes is lower than for high-income classes. So high-income classes will want a computer which is very performing, but then the price doesn't really matter. So it's not that they have a low or strong preference for price. They don't have really a preference for price. They would buy more or less a very rich class, whatever laptop, independent from the price. The important thing is that the quality is high. So this is how we take into account those preferences, which mainly come from research in psychology on consumer behavior. How this? No, go ahead.
Yes.
Go ahead, Francesco.
Thank you. No, I got it. Thank you. I understand.
How do we differ? How do we differ by countries? Now, this is a very important question. This is a closed economy. We're looking at one single country. However, what we're doing now is we have these 10 parameters, right? How do we analyze a model that changes across 10 different parameters with all the 10 parameters changing at the same time? So this obviously is a computational problem, because the combination of different values for 10 different parameters is the number of values at the power of 10. So it would mean running an amount of simulations which would require basically our entire lifetime to have some results. So what we use here to analyze this model are experimental designs, which allows us, which are basically used in engineering, which allows us to test the model in specific conditions. And here we use a 2K full factorial design, which is the simplest design. So we use a high and low value of these factors. Okay, so for all these conditions which define structural change in our model, we use high number of workers per manager, low number of workers per manager, high wage differential among tiers, low wage differential among tiers. And we combine all these high and low values for all these different parameters. So for all the different the factors that define the initial structure of the model and the way in which structural change evolves through time. Again, these are the the 10 different aspects that evolve through time to these parameters. So what we have in the end is a combination of 1,024 designs when we combine the different values of these 10 parameters. Okay, so this is like saying we're testing against one another 1,024 different countries that have different aspects of structural change initialized in a different ways. Okay, so they start from the same conditions, like in the table that we saw before, but slightly different conditions in terms of structural change. Everything else is the same, but one of these conditions in the rate of structural change differs among the countries. And so this is like testing all these different potential countries that start from everything else the same, apart from one parameter in the structural that define the structural change, which gives us these 1,024 combinations. We ran 20 replications for 2010 periods. Just to give you an idea, these amounts, when we did this exercise on a computer cluster of 120 computers, this required more or less 2 months of running simulations. Now we get, let's go to the results. What does this mean? What we find is that most of the factors that we embedded in the model have a strong impact on output growth, each by each. Okay, so they all change the amount of growth, even if all other factors are not changed. One single factor of structural change that we model here have an impact on the final growth, but with large differences. Not all of these factors are significant. Some are, but not all of them are. And in particular, the factors that we've seen are related to consumption shares and consumption preferences. So the one that you were pointing out, Francesco, are not significantly relevant in explaining changes in growth through time, through the 2000 periods. The effect of most factors is non-monotonous, so is non-linear, and the interaction is crucial. So in most cases, one single factor is relevant, but two factors together are more relevant. So let's take one example, the factor that determines the complexity of organization, so the amount of workers that manager can control. So as we said, because we have companies that grow more rapidly, evolving with, so creating more classes, when we have a lower value of this parameter, this increases growth. But it increases growth when we also have a high emergence, a fast emergence of new goods. So new sectors emerge quickly. And when organizational costs of creating new layers of workers are compensated by productivity growth, so when we have also fast changes in the capital goods sector in terms of productivity growth, and when we have large differences in wages between these organizational changes, between these organizational layers. Otherwise, the impact of organization is still significant, but much less significant. So it is the combination of these different aspects of structural change which is interesting to explain those different patterns that we observed in our initial table. When we look at a reduced form of the model and we study the main outcomes, variables, and parameters in terms of outputs, we do find that labor productivity and R&D expenditure definitely have a strong impact on economic growth. Product variety, in itself, so creating new products, is relevant only when we do not control for productivity. Okay, so by itself is relevant, but labor productivity is more relevant because it does create selection of firms through the price mechanism. Inequality overall is negative, has a negative impact on economic output. Although, as I mentioned, the differences between classes in terms of wages is positive, has a positive impact in terms of output. And this is, if you want, the principle which is behind the Kuznets curve. You need to create new classes that have higher purchasing power to create that demand, which also gives an input to produce new goods and to invest in new capital, which then leads to higher growth. Unless you have that difference, which is created initially, it's difficult to have a takeoff. So that inequality in the short period is something which is sort of needed because you need those differences. So it's not inequality per se which is needed, but it's the new demand which is needed. Obviously, you could still have this new demand with less inequality. But what is important is that you have a change in the consumption structure, so that you have consumers that, for one reason or another, request new goods, and new firms that emerge, which demand for new capital and create an incentive for invest in new R&D in the process and increase productivity. So yeah, and as I said, most of these parameters interact and are relevant when they interact. So coming to our main question about why regions with similar levels of output grow in such a different way, as we observed in that table initially, we do observe that the initial differences that determine growth, this growth divergence, are differences which define the structure of the economy initially, and the way in which the structure evolves along different lines. And again, different related aspects of structural change, such as organization of production, product variety, technological change in capital vintages, consumption, distribution, are all relevant, and they're mostly relevant when they interact. So most relevant factors are relevant. Most structural change factors are relevant for economic growth, and they're particularly relevant when we observe the way in which they interact one with another. So one single factor, again, is relevant, but not as relevant as two factors together. So this implies that we need to account, when we study those processes, for a large number of economic aspects, a large number of aspects of structural change in the short and the long run. And we need to study the micro interactions that lead to those changes, which are responsible for the evolution of this system to create structural change. And I'll stop here because I think we're getting a little bit late, although, sorry, we started also late. But is there any question? And then obviously we will discuss some of these issues as well in the tutorial. Is there any question for now? All clear? More or less. Okay, so do we have the groups for the afternoon? Do we have the groups made? Sorry, I'm quickly moving location.
Yes, of course. Of course.
So we have the groups for the 3 papers already.
Yeah, all managed perfectly by Andrea.
Okay.
And she
Okay.
managed groups.
Okay, perfect. So we will have the 3 presentations. If there's any question now about the model or the results, or anyone who wants to understand a little bit the details of the model, let me know. Or some more explanations about the result, let me know. Otherwise, we can discuss as well in the afternoon. Okay. So I guess everything was clear for now. So see you later. Thank you.
See you.